Welcome to another episode of the GayBarchives Show, where we explore gay history, one bar at a time. I'm your host, Art Smith, and today our guest is illustrator and artist David Lee Csicsko. So, welcome to the show, David.
Thank you.
You're quite welcome. You have a unique distinction among some of the guests that I've interviewed so far. I have interviewed a number of authors and bar owners and celebrities and people in different walks of life. I have not interviewed very many people who would classify themselves as not really a bar person. But you happen to be connected to a long-running, iconic Chicago bar that goes by the name of Berlin. I understand that you designed their logo for them. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So when did this relationship with Berlin begin?
So the relationship with Berlin actually begins with me moving right after I moved to Chicago. I went to the Cleveland Institute of Art in Cleveland and graduated in 1980. And then I moved home, which is Hammond, Indiana. And Chicago was always my dream New York City, but close by. And I really wanted to be working for all the museums in Chicago or get a job there. And also I wanted to work for Marshall Fields and the Chicago Tribune and Chicago Magazine. And eventually I found some freelance work with Marshall Fields, and the art director who kind of discovered me and really gave me a big break. His name is Paul Niski. He introduced me to another illustrator artist named Marianne Enriquez. She went by May Enriquez. And we were talking and she said, "Oh, I have to run. I'm moving out of my apartment." And I said, "Why are you leaving?" And she said, "I'm moving in with my boyfriend." And I said, "I'll take your apartment," because I was intimidated by the idea of looking for an apartment. So I moved into her apartment, and then she introduced me to her friends. And one spring day, she invited me to a party that a guy who sadly passed away due to AIDS years later, his name was Rick Menke. He was from Maryland, and he was this beautiful, handsome, amazingly sunny young man, very talented. And he was from Maryland, and he had a crab boil in his apartment on Belmont. And at that party was who would be the owners of Berlin, Shirley and Tim, in the fall of 1983. And we started talking, and I told them who I was and what I'd been doing. And they said, "Well, why don't you design our logo?" And I was like, "That sounds so super cool." So I showed them a bunch of ideas, and they told me that the idea of the bar was to reference Berlin in the 1920s and sort of the hedonism of the Weimar Republic and just this whole cabaret Berlin era. And this is before computers and the internet. It was also the height of the sort of new wave look, which I was definitely a part of. And so I created this sort of funky pointy angular curve hand cut out type that spelled out the word Berlin. And then I drew this very funky looking guy with a bulging eye smiling and staring at a martini. And that became their iconic look and logo. And a couple of months later, after it opened, they hired a guy to make my lettering as 3D metal letters, which hang above the bar and still do to this day. And it was a really exciting time, and they were one of the first video bars to open, which was their sort of claim to fame. And at the time, I said, "Well, what kind of bar is this going to be?" And they said, "We don't know right now. It's a bar where you can watch videos and get cocktails, and it's for everybody." So I went to the opening night party, and it was a blast. And then the next day, I called my parents and I said, "Why don't you come to this bar that I did the logo and have cocktails and watch videos?" So my parents took the train in from Hammond, Indiana, met me at Belmont, and we were there for like 2 or 3 hours, and then they went home, and then Berlin grew into this enormous existence, like a very, very popular and much loved kind of alternative bar. And to this day, it's still drawing crowds. Although now it doesn't start getting hot until much later. Before, it's like they opened at 5, and then fun began at 9 or 10. Now I think the fun begins at midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning. But what's unique about Berlin is it's found its own audience and reinvents itself. So the people who go there now are really young club kids. And anyway, it's so cool that it's still around. And sadly, we lost Tim due to AIDS. And then Shirley had another partner, and now it's owned by, maybe it's been bought a few times. I don't know. I don't know all of that technical part. But every now and then they invite me to whenever there's an anniversary, and which is really fun because it's great to be part of the bar's history, but it's part of my own personal history.
Yeah, and last month they celebrated, I believe it was their 39th anniversary.
That's crazy.
And so that means that the next anniversary coming up is going to be the 40th.
Yeah.
Which means you're going to be a big celebrity there. You're going to have to come up with some really fancy outfit for the red carpet.
Huh. Well, I've got several months to plan.
Yes, you do. Now, I've noticed looking at pictures of Berlin, the pictures that I've seen, it kind of seems to have, as far as the decor is concerned, kind of a mid-century industrial kind of feel to it in some of the pictures. Is that the way it was originally designed, or
originally it was much smaller? It was just one section, and then it took off, and then they expanded and became bigger. But it was sort of it was more new wave looking, and kind of there's a name for that sort of look that was popular in the 80s. Not industrial chic, but something like that. That it was sort of like industrial glass block, fun colors, fun shapes, and then it's changed. They've redone it 1 or 2 times, but maybe now it looks more mid-century.
Now, I've also noticed in a number of the pictures, and this might be partially because of what they want to feature on social media over the years, but they seem to have kind of a funky crowd. I've seen pictures of, shirtless guys in pink pants with their face painted and kind of Halloween.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think it really appeals to a fresh, visually adventurous crowd. That anything goes, and I think anything is probably welcome. And it's always been that way. It's always been kind of an alternative type of place, even though it was really popular. It definitely holds its own and stands out from other bars that are on Halsted Street for sure.
So speaking of Halsted Street, how is Berlin situated relative to where the core area of gay bars on Halsted Street was located?
It's several blocks away. So basically the heart of Halsted is like Roscoe and Halsted, or Roscoe and Cornelia. And then Berlin it's not a half a mile, but it's a good long walk to get there. But I was talking to some friends of mine, and a friend of mine, my partner actually, went there one night late with Iman, the wife of David Bowie. And another friend of mine said that he ran into Robert De Niro at some place and said, where do we need to go? And they suggested, I don't know what year this was, but he goes, you need to go to Berlin. So my friend took Robert De Niro and some other movie star, and they were game to go. So it's always kind of like held its own, um, and yet it's really different from the Halstead bar. Sorry, I'm coughing. I'm just getting over a cold.
Well, we'll try to edit out as much as we can.
Okay.
Um, so you're saying that basically this has kind of the vibe of a funky alternative bar as
Yes.
opposed to a traditional gay male cruising bar where it would all be men looking at other men. This is actually a bar where, straight people or more liberal people could come in and feel at home and have a good time and not be.
Well, I think it's definitely LGBTQ all the way, but it's got that sort of crossover.
Yeah. I'm looking at some of the old ads, and I'm going to be putting up images of some of their ads and photographs from the bar. But I'm looking at one in particular that I know you did. It's Halloween at Berlin, and it has your little bug-eyed guy with a martini and the logo at the bottom, and then a series of black and white masks down the margin of the page, and it just looks like something that you would have pulled together. But I
It's
noticed in the
quite possible. I mean, I participated with them for many years, and then obviously then things changed, and but every now and then I'll see things where they're still using several of my original images.
now in this particular ad, um, it has the phrase in there, "Ich bin ein Berliner," which, if I'm not mistaken, is that the phrase that JFK used when he went
Yes,
over to Berlin and was laughed
yes,
at because it
yes.
meant "I am a donut"?
Well, well, I think he may have
Mispronounced it.
said it, but and I think this might be I don't know if that's the corrected version, but doesn't it wasn't this phrase supposed to mean we are all Berliners?
Yeah, I think so. I
Yes,
think that was the purpose.
that was yeah.
Now, when you first went there in the beginning, did Berlin have a specific type of crowd? Was it mostly younger white men or, a wide range?
No. It was rather diverse. Many of my non-white friends, it was definitely their place. It had a strong Hispanic crowd, a young African American gay crowd. It was really diverse, and I remember being there with a Filipino friend of mine who basically lived there. His name is Ron Laxmana, and he has a career in as a fashion stylist. But I remember being there with him and meeting younger Puerto Rican and Hispanic, beautiful young men who what seemed daring at the time were which isn't daring now at all. But I just remember seeing them wearing pearl necklaces that were pink and being these sort of sultry, macho yet slightly femi uh, people that it just felt like there was a great amount of excitement and acceptance as opposed to a gay bar that you have to have a certain look to sort of fit in.
Right. Did their music also reflect that? Was their music a little more eclectic than some of the other bars might have been at the time?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it was very driven originally by the videos, the whole MTV era, and it was like at the height of uh what was like I remember seeing early Boy George Culture Club videos. Um, the guy, I think he was from Genesis, but he broke off and he had a famous video jump and he just like jumps through the whole thing.
Oh yeah.
I remember just seeing. I also just remembering seeing incredibly visual video content, but then also they would have marvelous drag shows. There was a friend of ours who got into drag by going there. Who sadly he passed away like 2 years ago, but his name was Danny. I think his name was Danny Morales, and his character was Aquanetta, which was the hairspray.
Right.
Aquanet.
Yeah, I've also noticed looking through their timeline on social media that they've posted a number of pictures from different events they had. And I'm assuming a number of these come from a Halloween event. But the costuming I'm seeing there is also kind of very edgy and artsy. The people that are attending are going all in. It's not like a typical gay bar where every costume involves a G string and a pair of tennis shoes and maybe some spiked up hair. They're doing full body paint, extravagant costumes. Like they're really almost performance artists attending the bar as patrons.
Oh, absolutely. It definitely has a club kid appeal.
Now, I noticed that on their website they had a picture of a Berlin T-shirt, and it has your original logo on it. So hopefully they're paying homage to you with that as well, because
That's nice.
it
That's
definitely
nice.
looks cool. They did it in a white imprint on a black T-shirt.
Very cool. Well, I remember also going there to see Lipsinka when Lipsinka was just becoming a sensation.
Was that kind of her home bar, or was she just traveling through town,
No, no, she was traveling around. I think she was based out of New York.
as so many drag queens have been?
Yeah.
So, are there any particularly memorable experiences that you personally had at Berlin?
A couple. I mean, I remember going there for like early New Year's Eve parties right after they opened, and just that was a lot of fun. And I'm sure we went there for Halloween many times. Um, and also like they would have great like alternative things like Lady Bunny came to perform on Easter Sunday.
Yeah,
um,
she's quite the character.
yes, yes.
So, did that association with Berlin help elevate your the awareness of your art at all in the gay community, or was it just another job that you did and we're kind of proud to be associated with the bar?
It's a little bit of both. I definitely because of it, I was asked to participate um, with a lot of other sort of either gay causes or gay charities, and also it was sort of right when the tragedy of AIDS was surrounding us that because of my work with Berlin. And a lot of the bars, gay bars in Chicago, have been very generous towards causes and raising money and awareness um, all along. Um, that it kind of led me into that community, um, and so I plus a lot of my friends went there, and also when it was starting. Um, Belmont Street was really a funky street. And about the same time, I started doing projects for Ann Sather's restaurant. Eventually, I wound up designing their logo. Um, a friend of mine, Patrick Lavery, opened up a fantastic flower shop in the '90s called Secret Garden, and I wound up doing that logo. And I was the guy of Belmont Avenue. And then Tom Tunney, who owned Ann Sather's, asked me to decorate the L stop, which is right where if you take the train to Berlin, you get off right there. So I created this series of heads that hung over the street for 10 years. And then the CTA started improving stations, and they rebuilt Belmont Station, and there was a competition. And so I was a finalist to be the artist to do a mosaic. And it I eventually I won the project, and but the images were sort of a reference to those early Berlin club days, and um, uh, just sort of the fun and excitement that was a part of that neighborhood.
Now, I've seen that you've done, your artwork is pretty extensive in the types of media you've worked in and how your images have been reproduced. I've seen what looks like a mosaic tile mural
Yeah,
for an elementary school, maybe.
that's a new one. Yeah,
Um, I've seen a lot of different graphic images. I've seen a wine bottle label,
yeah,
shopping bags, posters
yeah,
for various film events and charitable events.
yeah.
So you've done quite a variety um, of work over the years. Did that kind of evolve after you got involved with Berlin? Were you starting to branch out and do more
Oh
other?
yeah, yeah. Oh, definitely, definitely, definitely. I mean, Berlin was just one project,
Right.
and I'm somebody who loves working and needs to work as an artist to put food on the table and pay bills and everything. So I'm constantly looking for lots of projects, and I've been very lucky that my designs can be adapted to everything from logos to labels for like this. It's actually that I think what you're referring to is actually a cider label, um, a Christmas cider,
Ah,
um, and also mosaics and stained glass windows, a variety of things, and I love it, and it really gives me a chance to flex my thinking and the way I do things, and I love playing around with bold colors and patterns, and it's just everything is like another thing to do, and I try to bring a freshness and a different energy that you would get from another artist. So I'm lucky that what I do, people come to me because they like what I do.
yeah, and they're not overly complicated where people look at them and have to think about them for hours or whatever. They're very bold, graphic, simple shapes in a lot of them, but very expressive. They're
Yeah, I try really hard to come up with a fresh idea that hopefully communicates something when you see it, um, and is easy to understand. That's important to me.
Now I've noticed when I've looked through some of your artwork, you've got various different holiday images. I've seen one that looks like it might be a Thanksgiving image with a pilgrim and an
Yeah,
Indian. Uh,
yeah.
do you do those for commercial purposes? Are they actually products that are appearing on, say, greeting cards, or are they just images that you've done because you were inspired to do them?
It's both. It's both. To answer you, it's both. So some of the images are things that I just think about, or are just pure expression, but other things are things that I do for various projects. Like I have this wonderful gig with Mariano's grocery store in Chicago. Are these ongoing, fun, bold, reusable grocery bags that are printed on recycled fabric, um, and um, it's this ongoing series, which is great. It's marvelous for me to see people carrying a little bit of me all over the place.
So while you're out and about in Chicago, you see people walking down the street with your shopping bags, and it kind of puts a little smile on your
Oh,
face.
absolutely. I see shopping bags. I see T-shirts I've designed. I have a running gig with the classical music station WFMT, um, and every time when they have a fundraiser, thankfully, they call me and say we want you to work on something. So I do a lot of T-shirts for them and a lot of mug designs, things like that. And I'll see people in my T-shirts all the time. Sometimes I'll say, "Hey, I'm the one who did that," and sometimes I just keep walking. Um, and uh, also for close to 30 years, I've been volunteering with Groceryland, which is a AIDS based charity that uh, provides meals and groceries for people who are either HIV positive or AIDS who are in need. and it winds up being a free place if they qualify for groceries or meals. And every year I do a t-shirt for the volunteers. I've done a lot of art there. When they opened back in the early 90s, I did this mural for them that the marvelous woman who runs Groceryland is Lori Cannon, a great fixture in the LGBT community as a real caring soul who was on in the early days. It used to be called Open Hand, but now it's called Grocery. Well, it was called Open Hand. It became something else, and now it currently is called Vital Bridge. It's either Vital Bridges or Heartland Alliance. I think the final umbrella that they are under is Heartland Alliance. But Groceryland is has a couple locations in different neighborhoods, but I'm definitely associated with the North Side location. And when they first started it, they talked to their clients who got Meals on Wheels, who said, some days we'd like to walk to a grocery store and get groceries. So by listening to the community, they created this marvelous place, and they didn't want it to feel institutional. They made it feel like Pee-wee's Playhouse. It was just very fun and playful and warm, and not at all like an institutional or government kind of type of place. And so I was thinking about them as an organization. And so I thought of my favorite ancient Roman sculpture of the giant she-wolf feeding the suckling Romulus and Remus back in ancient Rome. So I did a fun, silly version of that where the she-wolf has a beehive hairdo, and the two babies, one is yellow, one is blue, and then there are just these fun sort of fruit characters around it, and representation of Chicago buildings. But they've been very open to receive all of my ideas. So I try to bring a cool way of thinking about something, and hopefully something that the people they'll get the symbolism, that it's not too hard to get.
Now, when you were coming out of art school, that was at a time when the world was just being exposed to the artwork of, say, Keith Haring.
Right.
He was up and coming about the same time. He was a New York City street artist that did, random paintings almost anywhere at that time.
Anywhere, yeah.
And they were almost like throwaway art. I mean, I have friends of mine who have original Keith Harings that he scribbled on the back of a flyer that came, from a grocery store or something.
Yeah.
And it was a much different world then. But in some ways, your artwork has some similar vibe to his, the way it's got that kind of angular simplicity and expressive, emotive look to it. Did that have any influence on you, or was it just coincidental that you both kind of started?
Yeah, it's totally, it's coincidental, but it was the energy that was in the air, I believe, at the time.
Right.
And I know, like when I was in art school, I didn't have the style that emerged a few years later. But what made me stand out was I started cutting things out of black contact paper with these spiky angular shapes, which totally related to new wave music and punk.
Uh-huh.
And as it grew, it was just sort of the vibe in the air. Definitely, like I was always, like in the early days, called the new wave Matisse, because I cut things out. And I always knew of Keith Haring. I never had the opportunity to meet him, but he was off doing his own thing, and he was in New York, and I was in Chicago doing my own thing. But they're definitely, we came up at the same time.
Yeah, I can see how that would have been appropriate for that era. I was a young adult at that time, so I'm familiar with that time frame, with what the energy was, both in the gay scene and the general scene at large. And I can totally relate to that. I could see how that, would be an appropriate kind of style. I'm sure when you were in art school, if you had expressed much of that, you probably would have gotten a couple of odd looks from some of your fellow students or teachers who thought it was a little bit avant-garde for, you know, what they
Well,
were.
it was beginning to happen like in the spring of my last year in school, and uh, it was kind of where things were sort of like changing. But also when I got out of school, it was what was being bought as illustration was realistic airbrush kind of rock and roll covers, and I wasn't doing that. It was more angular and simpler, but it found its own footing. And what was amazing was that the funky stuff I was doing, I was able to sort of refine it more from when I did ads for Marshall Fields. That the inspiration was definitely Art Deco, and just trying to become really sophisticated, but still with this sort of like little funky edge to it. And I just constantly kept, I draw every day. And recently, because of when COVID happened, I started looking and finding my old sketchbooks and playing around with that. And it's just really fun to see how trusting people were, because a couple of things that I got published in Chicago Magazine, I thought, gosh, this looks like I don't know what I'm doing at all. It's so raw and primitive compared to how sophisticated it became later. But it all comes from the same place.
Yeah, and as it turns out, the style that you and Keith and others have adopted has a timeless quality to it. You know, a lot of other types of artwork, you look at a picture that was drawn in the 70s or the 80s or even the 90s, and you can almost date them just by looking at the way they were drawn. But
Yeah,
these kind of funky graphic images have a certain degree of timelessness to them. I'm sure you
yeah,
have drawings from 1985 that you could post
yeah,
today and people would say, wow, that's fresh. Oh, very cool. It's a guy on a bike.
yeah. This was from like 1982.
That is gorgeous.
Um, just before COVID happened, I got to visit the archive of Chicago Magazine, where I had been a contributor for like 15 years. And sometimes I would get the art back and sometimes I wouldn't. But I got to record everything on my cell phone by going through all the back issues. And I was in the magazine every month for like 15 years, and sometimes several times a month, because different departments would give me different jobs. So this one was for, believe it or not, I illustrated a editorial on what was happening in sports for a while. And so this was about bike racing, where bike racing and the Tour de France had always been there, but sort of excitement for the Tour de France was just starting in America. And I think that's what this story was about. And so I took a picture of the published illustration, and somewhere in my house I have a little original, but with the technology, I'm able to recreate it on a computer and make it any size now, and also improve like what I would have done differently, because now I'm so much wiser than I was when I was 23, 24. And so anyway, it's been a lot of fun to sort of revisit my past visually and sort of play and go back and forth. And um, I'm just so happy to be working still as an artist, and hopefully people still find me relevant.
Well, you certainly have done some very interesting pieces, and every one of them I look at, it kind of makes me smile. I'm just like, you did a Frankenstein image that has a fork through his neck, and it's like
Yeah,
a
yeah,
different twist and kind of Halloweeny and kind of,
yeah.
you know, but definitely cool. And
Thanks.
and I see that so often in the pieces that I've seen from you. I can imagine your artwork going in the same direction as, say, Keith Haring, where they've taken those designs and put them on, you know, neckties and running shoes
Yeah,
and sweatpants and t-shirts and
yeah.
everything else on the planet. So there's some very cool designs there.
Thanks.
Oh, you're quite welcome. And of course, you got to try your hand at a new product a couple of years ago when the world was introduced to the fabric COVID mask.
Yes, yes, yes.
And
You
you did a
you
whole
did your
selection
you
of
did
that.
your research.
Yeah. Um, we're going to put up a picture of one of them that I happen to love. It's this big kind of smiling face with a red heart on the nose, and the guy's face is all painted white with black hair. It's just and a skeleton hands. It's such a cool
Yeah,
looking
yeah, yeah.
image.
Um that was something I that the mask company, someone sent them that picture, and I absolutely love it. I absolutely love it. It was supposed to be a Day of the Dead
Yeah,
mask, and this young person created this persona, and it's a fantastic picture.
it is. Now, more recently, um, you've started to do some books
Yes,
feature your illustrations with text by some other author. I assume they vary from
they
book.
vary. Yes, yes.
The one that particularly caught my attention first, for a couple of reasons, is the book LGBTQ plus Icons. And I had already interviewed Owen Keenan, so I was aware of the concept and the book coming out. But then I saw the illustrations and I said, wow, these are just really awesome. So you collaborated with Owen. I assume he wrote most of the descriptions in the book,
He
and
he
you
wrote
did,
all of them. Yeah.
and you did all of the illustrations.
Yes.
But you took how many um, LGBTQ icons and converted them into kind of your style of
Right.
portraiture for the book?
So the final count in the book was 50 people, which is really hard to narrow down. So um, a lot of some very famous people are left out because we were trying to be more inclusive, and not have the book just filled with famous white gay men. Um, and so we just didn't have room. Like one of my heroes definitely was Noel Coward. We didn't have room for him. I did a portrait of Tennessee Williams. In the end, we decided not to go with him. I recently read a wonderful biography on Patrick Dennis, who wrote all the anti-MAME stories, and his great funny novel created that great movie, Anti-MAME. And I had read his biography, and I just love this guy who actually was this goofy guy that grew up in Evanston and loved Chicago and loved dancing and loved putting on plays, and as a Boy Scout wrote theatricals for the Boy Scouts, and sometimes really daring, um, naughty. He was ahead of his time. Very very playful and inventive, and because of the time he lived in, he was definitely bi, and was married, had two kids, and then started exploring, and eventually left his wife and was going to move to Morocco with his boyfriend. And when he got there, the boyfriend said, "Oh, I'm marrying this woman as a cover, and that way we can leave her together." And he said, I don't want to have that kind of life. And so then he moved to Mexico and lived in Mexico City, and just was sort of this bon vivant in Mexico City. And all these celebrities would come to his parties. And then his books sort of fell out of fashion. And then at the end of his life, he was the butler for the guy that owned McDonald's Corporation.
Ray
It's
Kroc.
just, yeah, yeah.
Ray
It's this
Kroc.
really fascinating story. If you can find the biography of Patrick Dennis, it's really an incredible read.
Oh,
But
absolutely.
yeah, in the end, there wasn't room for him, and it's one of these things. Working on a project like this, you feel a great responsibility because there's so many great people out there that if we don't tell their stories, they'll be forgotten, and it's really hard to figure out when it's narrowed down to 50 who's going to be included. But a real important thing um, for Owen, myself, and the publisher was that the book was intended to be very, very inclusive. So, uh, and the cool thing about doing research is that once you're reading about somebody, you find about someone else, and it sort of leaves you down this rabbit hole of all of these characters who may have known each other or were friends with each other. Um, that just kind of I love doing research. I always have doing visual research and just looking things up on the computer, different people. I love that, and so this book really kind of came out as it was an idea I had. Owen at the time was working part time at Unabridged Books, which is this marvelous bookstore in my neighborhood, and it was the height of the early days of COVID where you had to wear a mask everywhere. And I would go to visit him once a week, and we were standing in front of sort of the gay LGBTQ section. And I said, if we collaborated on a book, I think it'd be a lot cooler and more fun than what we're seeing in front of us. That I think there's another market out there that we could tap into. And then he goes, I think we might be able to get some funding for this project. So Owen is really good friends with Victor Salvo, who years ago had started the Legacy Project on Halsted Street, which is this amazing feature of kind of an open air museum that features portraits of 40 people who are all LGBTQ plus, who have since passed away, but they've contributed to culture. And so they got a grant, which at the time seemed marvelous, but now it seems controversial, especially where you live in Florida. But they got a grant to create education materials for youth to teach gay history in Chicago public schools. Because often what happens when you talk about someone, if they were gay or lesbian, it was kind of left out of the story. And so these 40 people that they had chosen range from Lorraine Hansberry, Cole Porter's in there, Leonard Bernstein's in there, lots of people. And so I started working on these educational materials. And then at the same time, when COVID was, this was like the second year of COVID, I was offered the opportunity, my husband and I, to go and house sit for someone who lives in Douglas, Michigan, which is right next to Saugatuck. And Saugatuck has always been a welcoming spot for the LGBTQ community and the arts. And so I was staying in this woman's really lovely home, and I sent her some pictures of what I was working on. She goes, "Oh, our local history museum is doing a big exhibit on 100 years of gay history, and they should see this." So they looked at it and decided that they wanted to have an exhibit of my art, which we had. And then I was already working with this Chicago publisher on a science book called Science People. And he came to the opening and he said, "This has to be our first book. We're going to put Science People on hold, and I want you to go home and round this out to 50 individuals." And so in a very short amount of time, we created the content. And it was definitely a very big, much a collaboration between Owen and I of who we wanted, who were important to us, and sort of finding that balance. But we really also wanted to be very representative of the non-white community. So there's lots of people in it.
So it was really interesting to hear, you talking about Patrick Dennis and not being able to include him in there. I happen to be a huge fan of the movie Anti-Mame.
Yes.
Not so much the movie Mame.
Yes.
But I always thought he was an interesting character, but I didn't realize that there was that much connection to what we used to call the gay community in his life. And that's really, that is really interesting to learn that. And hopefully you will be able to do a second book.
Yes, we're definitely hoping that one of the things that we had decided was that everyone in the book has passed away, as opposed to celebrating living people. This was meant to be like a history book.
Well, I definitely can see where there would be room for a second and possibly third
Yes.
book celebrating different, more people from the community in there. And I think one thing about what I can see from the book, the descriptions about the people that Owen wrote are not so long and wordy and difficult to comprehend that they're going to bore people to tears unless they're
Right.
historians. And the images are so bright and animated and fun that they add a sense of character to the people that you're representing in there. So it's a great collaboration.
Oh, it's something I'm incredibly proud of, and we both got to speak at a LGBTQ journalism conference that was in Chicago early in the summer, and someone said you need to do a book on LGBTQ people in sports. And I mentioned that to the publisher, and he goes, "I love." And the publisher is straight, and he said, "I love that idea. I love that idea." So hopefully, this series will continue. We after so LGBTQ Icons in the Arts came out in late spring, early summer, and then the Science People, which is not a gay book. It's just a very inclusive worldwide look at scientists past, present, and younger scientists who are making a difference in the world. But again, the inclusivity, really trying to be very broad and celebrate some of the famous scientists, but scientists you may not have heard of. And that was a lot of fun to research and work on. And we're just wrapping up iconic composers, which again is a big effort to. We've left out some very famous composers. There are several in there, but also composers that you may not have heard of, just to sort of keep their legacy there, and hopefully it'll inspire people to listen to their music and learn more about them. So they're all intended to be a quick dip, like dipping your toe into the pool of education, of learning about people.
Yeah, I can totally understand the challenges you're coming up against, because when I first started this project, it kind of mushroomed in the way that you mentioned earlier with the icons. I started talking to one person who was an owner of several gay bars in Atlanta. We started talking about the history of the bars, and then conversations with other friends said, yeah, I remember those bars, but then there was this bar, and then there was that bar.
Right.
And within 6 months, I had like hundreds of bars on my plate. And now we're at over 3,000.
That's great.
But people ask me all the time, are you going to write a book about them? And I'm like, well, yeah, I had that on the back of my brain since we started this. But now how do you narrow it down? Because, you have 3,000 bars to talk about. You're not going to write a book.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
now you have to filter them down and figure out how to make them presentable.
yeah.
But it's fascinating. I love the research too. And you keep stumbling across little known facts and bizarre connections and, places that you didn't know had gay bars. I put up a post the other day about the fact that I had uncovered 7 or 8 bars across the country, gay bars that were called Detour. In all these different cities, they all decided to have a gay bar called Detour.
Huh.
So I was soliciting information from my GayBarchives group members and said, do any of y'all remember any other gay bars named Detour? And they came up with a couple more, one in Raleigh, North Carolina, that was open about 6 months. Another one, I can't remember where. And then I stumbled across one in Pretoria, South Africa.
Wow.
And I'm like, it's just one of those eye openers. You're like, oh, wow, this is, more extensive than I expected. And some of the stories that go along with these, I'm sure both the icons and the bars that I'm researching just are enlightening. You listen to them and you're like, wow, I didn't realize that happened, that long ago, or was that popular with the gay community in that time frame.
Yeah, yeah.
But so you've got several other books that you're working on. You mentioned that you've got the composer's book, which I assume has a slight bit of crossover with the LGBTQ icons. I'm sure there's one or two people that are.
Well, it was hard to narrow down for what gay composers to include in the LGBTQ book, and also since this was um, uh, intended for youth, there were a handful of people that maybe are harder to talk about, like Benjamin Britten. I did a gorgeous drawing of him, but he's sort of problematic that he liked being in the company of young boys. Supposedly nothing ever happened, but that we just sort of had to draw the line.
Yeah, that puts up the pedophile flag that nobody
Right. And so it's hard to, so it wasn't appropriate to have him in a book for a younger audience. But because Leonard Bernstein is such a huge figure in American music, he is in the LGBTQ book, but he also appears with a new portrait I did of him in a different style for the music book.
Well, I'm looking forward to seeing that one as well. But the LGBTQ plus icons is definitely at the top of my reading list. Um, I just think that the illustrations are fabulous. I can see so many applications for them down the road as far as supporting different LGBT choruses and musical groups and things that you can connect with, concerts or whatever. That
Yeah. Well, hopefully it'll be something that can be excuse me. Hopefully, it will catch on and be purchased as a fundraising tool for like human rights campaign and different sort of gay charities, like the Gay Men's Chorus of what you name the city. There's a Gay Men's Chorus, right. And also that I can make prints of the images, so they can sell the print with the book, and then I can personalize it. And also, for several of my gay friends, I said, well, why don't I do your portrait and style of this book so that you can have it hanging and you can have the book underneath it. You can say, look, and that's been a sweet novelty that a lot of people have said, yes, please.
Well, hopefully I'll be famous enough someday that I'll find myself in a David Lee Csicsko portrait somewhere. But we'll see how that evolves. So obviously, if you get to do another LGBTQ icons book, Patrick Dennis is going to be there and probably on the cover, I hope.
Well, that's another thing that, like, with the we decided, well, it's hard because you want to have someone on the cover that sort of is recognizable. So on the cover of this one is Frida Kahlo, who is easy to identify. Yeah, she's easy to identify, even in my stylized way of drawing her. But we figured she was eye catching, that you kind of knew who she was. Her name is on there as well. So it's a matter. So like with the science book, we talked really long, the publisher and I, that Jane Goodall was on the cover, and it was important to have a woman scientist on there, but one who was recognizable. And so for the composer book, recently he's becoming famous again, but at the time of Mozart was he was African, Caribbean, and French. His name was Chevalier de Saint George, and he was a fencer, but also wrote music at the time, same time that Mozart was writing music. And for a while there, he was known as the Black Mozart. But his music is being uncovered, and he's somebody who, probably because he was Black, his music wasn't as popular, or doors were not open to him because of his skin color. And so we had a long discussion and decided to put him on the cover. And it looks great. So when we do LGBTQ Icons Part 2, I have no idea who'll be on the cover.
Yeah,
but I'll definitely keep Patrick Tennyson there because I loved reading his biography, and also I loved Auntie Mame so much. And actually, when they made it into the musical, even though it was based on his story, somehow the producers kept him out of the project and paid him nothing for the use of his story. And at the time, which was in the, I think in either the late 60s or early 70s, um, it was earning a million plus a week on Broadway, and it ran for years and years and years. But eventually, after he died, his two children were finally compensated for the money that he wasn't getting because of some weird deal on Broadway. So the family finally got the money.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. And I kind of see your book, the LGBTQ Icon book, as being kind of another entry into history that reminds me in some ways. I don't know if you can relate to this, but when the movie Amadeus came out, suddenly people started to have some interest in Mozart again. I mean, younger people.
Absolutely,
And I
absolutely.
think your book has that same kind of vibe, that it's approachable, it's fun, it's entertaining, and it introduces history in a way that is not, very stuffy and pedagogical, that pushes people.
Yes, absolutely. And I think there's a whole new sensibility. Like a lot of music people hate the movie Amadeus because they feel like he was portrayed as a buffoon. And to me, it humanized him. It was the first time he was presented as a human with real problems, putting food on the table and the complexities of his own life. Um, that it also opened the door to different ways of doing the music. And there's a lot of young people now who are talking about music and art and other subjects in a fresher way that isn't this blue-haired academic, big worded way of speaking. It's there's a new dialogue definitely happening.
Well, that's definitely a good thing. And spending as much time as I do trying to record our gay history of the bars, which I feel like is a big part that is being kind of brushed under the carpet. A lot of people want to talk about the activists and the politicians and all this. And the bars were so much a part of our community back then that, I'm really glad that I've had the opportunity to speak with so many people and to kind of start preserving memories of so many of the spaces that helped us evolve into the community that we are today. And I
Well,
appreciate
absolutely. It's all interconnected. It's all connected.
And I appreciate the fact that you've taken, an hour out of your day to talk to us about Berlin and your connection with the gay bars in Chicago, and also the other work you're doing with your illustrations for the LGBTQ book, plus the science composers and everything else. So thank you so much for everything you do. And thank you for taking the time to talk to us today.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. This has been wonderful. I've been looking forward to it. I just apologize that I got this cold at the wrong time.
We will all survive.
Oh, yes, we will. Yes, we will.
That concludes another episode of the GayBarchives Show. For more information about this episode or to find more episodes, visit gaybarchives.com.